Okay, welcome everyone for being here at the second lecture of this fall 2024 term in Florence. Tonight we have a distinguished lecturer, Stefano Catelani. He is professor at Webster University in Geneva. And by trade, Stefano is a legal counselor. In other words, he's an avvocato, he's a professional in the field. But on top of everything, he has developed an expertise on the relationship between Renaissance corporations, the banking system of the early modern times, and the contribution, the legacy which has been developed by the Medici family to our society. And tonight, as you can see from the title here, he will talk about corporate governance and corporate social responsibility at the time of the Medici. Let me say that Stefano is continuing a tradition which started many years ago with when I was a student at the University of Florence for doing my PhD in England by professionals like Raymond de Rover. You know that one of the most important professionals in the field of the banking system of the Medici was not an historian, was not an economist, but was a banker. Okay, Raymond de Rover. And Stefano Catelani tonight will give us a general outline of how the banking firm system was organized in the Renaissance, and what kind of contribution this gives to us nowadays. Stefano, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Very kind of you, and thank you for a nice introduction. So you said that I have 45 minutes, correct? More or less.
45, 50 minutes, and then, let's say 10 to 15.
I have more slides here, so we'll probably have to accelerate a little bit.
Problem.
But let's start with a short introduction. So as Fabrizio said, I'm a lawyer by training, and I have been working in the field of international business law for my entire career. In addition, I'm also teaching the subject, and I have been teaching that now for almost 20 years. So that is really my field. But contrary to other lawyers, and especially to those which I had as my professors at the time I studied, who were focusing very much on the law, I've always liked the idea of bringing down barriers among various subjects. And I've always made an effort to teach law using the wide angle, which means that presenting it together with the political, economical, and historical connections, which I think make it much more interesting. And to be honest with you, I've always hated what we call the juridical or legal positivism, which means that you analyze a rule the same way as you analyze an insect. You dissect it, but you lose track of everything which goes around it. So tonight, we'll try to make an effort to present you this subject in that way by analyzing two specific areas of law, which are corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, and try to show how, in fact, there's nothing new under the sun, but in fact, they were introduced in different ways already at the time of the Renaissance, and more specifically at the time of the Medici. Now, having said that, I don't pretend to be an historian. I don't pretend to be an expert in general on the history of the Medici family. You have Fabrizio there, who is much more knowledgeable than me. So Fabrizio, please correct me if I say something wrong throughout the entire discussion. But let's start with the definition of corporate governance. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with corporations and what they represent in today's world, because they're an important and interesting component of our society today. So I guess corporate governance can be defined as the system by which companies are directed and controlled, in very simple words. And not just the big corporations, those which are listed in stock exchanges, but in general, every company has is facing the same problem, and it needs to be managed, directing, and controlled one way or the other. So the debate on corporate governance, which has been going on now for many decades, was primarily focus on to find ways to protect shareholders. And we have seen it many times when companies went bankrupt and shareholders lost everything. So in essence, it was a protection against abuses of management, and also, if you want, a protection against form of direct or indirect expropriation. But as I was saying, everything started in the Middle Age, and it started in the Middle Age because the two main type of corporations started in those days. And in fact, the two main forms of companies which we find already at that time are what we call the compagnia and the commenda. The compagnia is nothing else than what we call today the partnership, and the commenda is nothing else as what we call today the limited partnership. It's also interesting to see the origin of a name. The compagnia comes from Latin cum panis, which is basically an organization which is a family organized business. Cum panis means that these are the people who meet at dinner around the same table and eat together. That's why it's called that way. And it obviously gives us a distinct feeling that company and family business at the origin are exactly the same thing. The commenda is something which started separately in connections primarily with maritime ships, where risk was such that there was already a need to make a distinction between investors and managers, and especially to allocate the risks in different ways by limiting the liability of the investors to the amount invested, while not limiting the liability of the managers, but at the same time giving them full power to control the activity, the venture. It's also quite interesting to see that two types of companies developed in different Italian centers. So while the Compagnia was mainly a product of Florence and other Tuscan centers like Siena, and in fact, in some sources from the Middle Age, is called La Compagnia alla mode toscane, because it was the prevailing form came from Florence and Tuscany. The other type, the commenda, was mainly coming from maritime centers like Genoa and Venice, because there, of course, the maritime tradition was much more strong, and therefore it justifies that type of organization. You have plenty of examples of these organizations. I'm sure that some of you have heard about the Bardi and Peruzzi and the Acciaioli. They were called the medieval super companies. These are, in the Middle Age, the equivalent of today's Microsoft and Apple and others. Their role and their importance was such that they were lending money to kings and queens around Europe. And in fact, two of them, the Bardi and Peruzzi, failed primarily because the King of England, Edward III at that time, basically stopped to repay these loans. And these, together with other problems which happened pretty much at the same time, brought to their bankruptcy. They were organized already in those days in a manner which I would consider quite modern. There was an office of a chairman, which included the chairman, director general, and the treasury. And there are already external parties which deposited money with these organizations and allow them to manage their money in a manner which was considered to be acceptable, although it was a bit risky, because of course these were short-term deposits, while the investments were by definition long-term investments. One of the reasons why they failed, they went bankrupt, is because they were organized as a single entity. They were organized as a single entity, which means that they had basically one body and various branches, so main tree and various branches of the same tree. So therefore, when one of the tree is collapsing, one of the branches is collapsing, the entire body, the entire tree is at risk. And in fact, this is exactly what happened. Therefore, it's interesting to note that as a result of that, they already invented, and in fact, it was an invention which was primarily led by the Medici house, the concept of a holding company. You should remember that Cosimo de' Medici was married to a member of a Bardi family, Contessina de' Bardi. So he was fully aware of what had happened in the previous century to the Bardi and the Peruzzi as well. So they needed to find an alternative solution in order to at least try to limit the risks. As we will see, they were not able to limit them completely, but at least they made an attempt. Hence, the notion of a company, of a holding company, which means that you have one company at the top, controlling all other companies around Europe, and not only Europe, but also the Middle East. And therefore, you don't have the branches anymore, which are just an extension of the same organization, of the same legal body, if you want. But they become kind of separate bodies. Just to continue with the image of a tree, you have a big tree at the top and smaller trees behind, all controlled by the big one, but at least formally independent. It's quite interesting to notice that type of organization. I mean, the first scholars which have identified that type of organization are De Rover and Sapori, and they both stress how modern that organization was, because it anticipates a type of organization which we can find today in the modern world. Now, I skip the details about how the commander of the colleganza were organized, but I want to stress one thing, that this type of contract, which lies at the beginning of this entity, which is called commenda at the time, but then became in actually in more modern terms accomandita, is again in Florence becoming a full-fledged organization like in another company. So we switch from the contract to the real company, to the corporation, with the law which was approved in Florence in 1408 and then revised various times, which is regulating the accomandita, allowing the coexistence of unlimited and limited liability partners. And therefore, in that way, what used to be a contract developed by the practice becomes a true corporation called Compagnia in Via d'Accomandita. And again, that is a great innovation, which is again happening in Florence, and is then practically copied throughout Europe, because that term, accomandita, you have it practical in every language. In French, it's called commandite. In German, it's called commandite. So you find it in English, it's not called the same, but the concept is translated into the concept of limited partnership. So you can see that these type of innovations are copied rather quickly, and they become widespread across the entire continent. After that, we have a new invention, which this time is not coming from Florence and Tuscany, it's coming more from Northern Europe, and especially England and Holland, which is the predecessor of what we call the joint stock company. The joint stock company has a characteristic which is making it different from the other types of company. And if you want, the main characteristic is the fact that it has a juristic personality, as we call it. It's considered equivalent to a physical person. That is, again, another major revolution, because, of course, this type of organizations, this type of legal person, they don't exist in nature. They are an invention of the law. And they are an invention of the law for a very simple reason, because with the long-term trading activities, which now expand across the globe, we're already 150, 200 years later, beginning of the 17th century, there is a need for organizations which are permanent. While the two organizations I was mentioning before were created either for a specific trip, for a specific activity, or for a limited period of time, at this time now, there is a need to have something permanent. So they start from the company and from the limited partnership as they were invented in Tuscany. But then they adapt them to the new needs, making them permanent, giving the limited liability as a benefit to all the shareholders and not just to some, and making the certificates which represented part of the capital of these companies, of these corporations, which nowadays we call shares, transferable, freely transferable in the market. Hence, the need of creating organizations where these transfer could take place. And these organizations are known as stock exchanges. In that respect, and here it's another connection with the Italian and Tuscan tradition, it is probably interesting, you don't find it here in the slides, but I can mention it for you because I think it's an interesting connection. The term bourse, la bourse, which is the equivalent of stock exchange, and in fact you have the same word in various languages, that la borsa in Italian, la bourse in French, die Börse in German, while in English, it's in fact a different term called stock exchange. But where is the term coming from? Now we move a little bit north. We move from Florence to Bruges. In Bruges, in the middle of the 15th century, there was a square. And in this square, there were three main buildings. One was the house of the merchants from Florence. Another one was the house of the merchants from Venice. A third one was the house of the merchants from Genoa. In the middle of this three, a little bit on the side, there was an hotel. The hotel belonged to a family called Van der Börse. And this hotel happened to have a perch, a roof. And merchants had the habit of meeting under the roof of this hotel. So they started to use the expression on va à la bourse, on va chez les Van der Börse became on va à la bourse, and therefore the term bourse became a commonplace to designate a place where merchants were normally meeting to conduct their business. In fact, when Bruges declined and Antwerp is taking over, because Antwerp is becoming the second main center after Bruges to conduct commercial activities at the European level, So when Bruges is emerging and they are building a specific place for the merchants to gather, it becomes spontaneous to call it la bourse. So that term has then remained throughout Europe and in general, I would say throughout the world, and it was derived from that type of experience. As I said, only in England it's called a different way because there was an English guy in Antwerp, and when the English guy moves back to England and become the consultant of the Queen of Elizabeth I for economic matters, he's telling her we should do the same thing as they do it in Antwerp, but since we are here in England, in our honor, we're going to call it Royal Exchange instead of calling it La Bourse as it was called in Antwerp. But the origin is pretty much the same. So now, let me try to go a little bit faster. I just want to stress two things. The concept of the joint stock company, as we know it today, all the major corporations of the world, in essence, they are joint stock companies, starts really with these two colonial ventures, which are the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company. At the beginning, they were born as limited partnership with a limited duration, a limited time, but then they become permanent, and therefore there is a case of, how do we call it, genetic mutation. So I'm going to skip all the details about how we got there and how that happened, because that will take a lot of time. But it's interesting to note that these two corporations, which are now becoming probably the two most important corporations in the world at the time, for at least a couple of centuries. We're talking the period between the 17th century up to the 19th century. They are very much organized like modern corporations. And in addition, they play a significant political role. They play a significant political role because they perform also public functions. It's enough to remember that for a long period of time, the English East India Company was controlling India. And then India became a colony of a crown. But for a long time, it was really a possession of the private corporation. Even that is not completely new, and even that was copied, if you want, from the Italian tradition, because in Italy something similar had already happened before with the so-called Maone in Genoa, which controlled colonies like Chio and Focea, and especially with the so-called Banco di San Giorgio, which is a bank which was created in Genoa and which Machiavelli defines as a state within the state, because once again, a bank is controlling a colony like Corsica, for instance. So it gives you an idea about the role and the power exercised by this type of organizations. Organizations which remain in place for a long time, because this time we are talking about a duration of a couple of centuries, and which then give birth to modern capitalism as we know it today, and also to the thousands and thousands of corporations which have been created thereafter on the basis of this model. Because then we have a time of codification, we arrive at the Code Napoleon, And in the Code Napoleon, these three types of organizations are mentioned, disciplined, and therefore they become commonly used by everybody who wants to conduct business. Let me go back after this excursus on the development of corporations and the way they were organized. Let me go back to Florence a little bit, because I assume that is probably the part which is more interesting for you, and also, the essence of this presentation. Cosimo de' Medici used to say, banking is magic activity turned into reality. And in fact, the instruments used by banks and these corporations already at the time are already a kind of magic. It's enough to talk about the letters of credit or the letters of change, as we were called in the beginning, because it's a way to lend money to somebody. But by doing so, what are you doing in practice? You are making possible to spend today wealth which, in fact, only exists in the future. That is already a form of magic. You are materializing today wealth which does not exist yet. In addition, these letters of change can be traded. So what are you doing by trading this letter of change? You are transforming a personal relationship. Debt is nothing else than a personal relationship between a creditor and a debtor, okay? You are transforming a personal relationship, which by definition is immaterial, into something similar to a good, a physical product, because debt can be traded, can be sold and purchased as if it had become a physical product. Again, one of the major revolutions in the history of commerce and trade. So I think that it's probably correct to say that Cosimo was right. And he was also aware of the risk of bankruptcy, as we have seen before, knowing very well the experience of his predecessors like the Bardi and the Peruzzi. So he introduced the notion of a holding structure, which we have already seen. But of course, that was not taking away all the risk. I mean, risks were still present, and risks were mainly associated to the fact that the banks, in order to prosper, was kind of obliged to grant loans to sovereigns, to kings and queens, because that was kind of necessary in order to exchange benefits, to get permits and concessions in exchange for these loans, which were granted to the sovereigns, primarily to conduct wars, which means that, of course, they were quite risky. The other issue was expansion beyond the family, because, of course, to keep the entire organization limited to family members was becoming impossible. It was necessary to include at least members of other families which were either allied or which had some connections of some kind. So we can see in a minute that the role of these people was quite negative because they were not always good managers. Sometimes they were bad managers. There was, in essence, what we could call today poor corporate governance. This poor corporate governance was exacerbated by the fact that distance made difficult control in those days. And of course, it required a high level of trust. Hence, the need of putting at the top of these organizations people who are well known, coming from, as I said before, allied families. In addition, to protect themselves, the Medici didn't always include their name in the what was called at the time la ragione sociale, which means in the name of local companies which were conducting activities in various places. Among these various places, you can certainly include London. In London, Medici had a partnership which was again lending large sums to secular rulers, well known for their payment failures. And in fact, like Edward III before with the Bardi and Peruzzi, also Edward IV did the same thing, and he didn't repay some of the loans to the extent that the company in London had to be liquidated in 1478. Another company which went belly up was the company in Lyon, which was managed by another family member, Leonetto de Rossi, who was Lorenzo brothers-in-law. And again, he made a number of bad loans which were not repaid, and he did some other tricky things. But probably the most important, interesting case is what happened in Bruges, because in Bruges we had another member of an allied family, a guy called Tommaso Portinari. Tommaso, together with his brothers Acerrito and Pigello, was running the Bruges family. The other two brothers were running the Milan family. He's also very well known in connection to some of the famous paintings which were painted at the time by the so-called primitive Flamand. But he was evidently attracted more by the court life and luxury in general, to the point that he caused the failure of the Bruges subsidiary. In fact, he was granting loans to Charles the Bold. Charles the Bold, Charles le Téméraire in French, died soon afterward in the battlefield. So the whole, well, first of all, the entire duchy, the Bourgogne duchy, collapsed, and together with him, Tommaso, who in the end died poor. But we can still see some of the really good things he did at the time, because if you go and see the Van der Goes altarpiece painting, which you can see in the Uffizi gallery these days, you can see the portrait of Tommaso Portinari and his wife, Maria Baroncelli. There is also another one, which is more difficult to see because it's, this time it's in Gdańsk in Poland, which again was commissioned by Tommaso and painted by Memling, but it was taken over by pirates in the North Sea, and it was never given back. So that's the reason why today you can see that in Poland. So the special relationship, if you want, with the Portinari family was caused by the fact that the three brothers Portinari were, practically speaking, raised by Cosimo. After the death of their father in 14 31. Cosimo is taking care of the 3 children, raising them in their house, and then giving them positions of responsibility in the hope that they would follow his directions and his example. Something which, in fact, did not happen. And this habit of giving excessive loans to obtain social elevation became and remained a common feature, to the point that, as we have seen, it brought to the bankruptcy and the liquidation of several of the Medici companies around Europe. So in what respect can we say that corporate social responsibility? We have seen, let's say, the aspect linked to corporate governance, and more specifically, the consequences of poor governance, or to use another term, bad management, already in these days. To what extent can we say that corporate social responsibility also already existed at the time? What is corporate social responsibility? Here is defined as go beyond what is required to make a positive impact on society and the social environment through engagement with stakeholders. Please note that I'm using this term as opposed to shareholders. Shareholders are those which have part of the capital invested in the company, so they own shares, which means parts of a company. The stakeholders are those who do not own shares, but they have something at stake, which means that if a company is prospering, they derive a benefit, direct or indirect. If the company is going south, as we say, in fact, they will be damaged. So that includes employees, it includes banks, or in any case, lenders, which have lent money to a company, and it includes society at large. Because obviously, if these companies are prospering, society is going to derive a benefit. If it is not prospering, it's going to derive a disadvantage. It's interesting to note that in the Middle Age, there is also another shareholder, which is an unusual one, but it's mentioned in the bylaws, in the article of associations of these companies. And this shareholder is God. In those days, it was called Messer Domine Dio. And how do you remunerate God? Well, according to the mentality of the time, the best way to remunerate God is to give something to God representatives, which are the poor people. So poor people are treated as special shareholders. They do not pay, of course, in case of loss, also because they don't have any money, but are treated as privileged creditors in case of bankruptcy. And how can these poor people be identified? Then that is the role of the bishop. It's going to be up to the bishop to decide which poor people will have to be remunerated. In more practical terms, in those days, every company had some cash available in each warehouse, which was called fondaco, to be distributed to poor people during festivities. Donations were also made to former wealthy people who had lost their assets, who were not so wealthy anymore, but who would never admit that they had become poor. So these are what we call in Florence I poveri vergognosi di San Martino ridotti al lumicino. And I would encourage you to visit the San Martino Chapel if you haven't already done so, because it's very interesting. And that was created precisely to give support to the people who were once wealthy, but whose misfortune has now made them poor. because even for those people, there were donations which were regularly made, and Cosimo again encouraged very much this practice, and he was also doing it himself. So you can see that these merchants who built Florence and who also are, let's say, the makers of a Renaissance in a certain way, because without their money, nothing would have been done. They are actually moved by two main passions. One is greed, because they obviously won't make money. They are not at all generous in that respect. They are very greedy. They are very anxious to make money and to obtain social elevation of any kind. But the other one is fear of hell, and therefore need to demonstrate to God and to society in general that they were generous by making substantial investments in buildings, in churches, in monasteries, in all form of arts. That was a way to give back, but also to acquire consent, because you can say that with those activity, they were also buying the consent of society at large, gaining what would be called in modern legal terminology the license to operate, in the sense that a wide social consent which allowed them to continue to do what they were doing, and especially to continue to accumulate wealth, which they were doing so well. When you look at the figures, Cosimo spent a fortune on construction and artistic patronage. I mean, here you have some examples. He was already involved with Battistero doors. He renovated the San Lorenzo Basilica and built the monument to John 23rd of the Battistero. He commissioned the rebuilding of San Marco Convent, and built a library in his cell. Okay. In San Marco, there was a fresco of the Adoration of the Magi done by Fra Angelico, the Beato Angelico. The cost of San Marco renovation was huge for the time, 40,000 florins. And it's interesting that some of his paintings go around the same theme, the Magi. And in fact, the Compagnia dei Magi was regularly meeting in the San Marco convent and was organizing a celebration which was taking place every 3 years. It's also important to remember that even in the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, there is another painting with the subject of a Magi done by Benozzo Gozzoli, who was helping Fra Angelico in San Marco. So why the Magi are so important as a theme for Cosimo? Because obviously they represent a good example of rich people who are dear to God, dear to Jesus Christ. So the Magi are a kind of point of unity between real, virtual, and metaphysics. They are a symbol of the wealthy doing good deeds, and therefore, as such, being accepted by society at large and enjoying a large consent in society. Cosimo also did the Sacristy of San Lorenzo, the chapel in Santa Croce, the Badia Fiesolana, which is another interesting example of his intervention. And he did another thing. For instance, he was instrumental in causing the church council to move from Ferrara to Florence in 1439, and also to bring to Florence many famous Greek humanists, and also to convince Marsilio Ficino to start the Neoplatonic Academy in the carriage villa. Cosimo Library was expanded by Lorenzo. It became afterwards Biblioteca Laurenziana, but it was also used as a model for the Vatican library. Piero, after Cosimo, Piero was his son, of course, continued in the same vein to do this type of activities, which we call, as I said, in today's terminology, corporate social responsibility, increasing or at least enhancing the positive image of family by spending money in these activities, which of course were not bringing profits at all, but they were buying consent. They were a way to make their role a positive one in society and to make sure that people continue to approve their activities and to be on their side. So here again, you have another list of what Piero did. I think probably the most notable of these work of art is the Adoration of the Magi by Benozzo Gozzoli in the Medici Palace in Via Larga, because there you have the triumph of family. So all the family members can be recognized there, and they are part of this procession, which once again is the procession of the Magi. Kings and wealthy people dear to God. That's all they wanted to be. Lorenzo continued in the same vein. Again, he contributed to various things, University of Florence. He hired many of the artists. When he didn't hire them directly, he was kind of finding them new commissions with other people. And I have already mentioned the Biblioteca Laurenziana. The real problem is that, all of this costed a lot of money. Lorenzo's spending habits were huge. And in addition to that, he was more a humanist, a politician, not necessarily a banker, as Cosimo still was. Lorenzo was, in fact, playing prince. And his control over the managers was pretty loose. And we have seen some examples before. His control on Tommaso Portinari in Bruges, his control on Leonetto de Rossi in Lyon, his control of Francesco Sassetti in Geneva. I mean, Francesco Sassetti also became the general manager of the bank after having spent 20 years in Geneva. And he is buried now in Santa Trinita in the so-called Sassetti Chapel, which was painted by Ghirlandaio. Other members of the bank were the Tornabuoni family, and you have fresco of the Tornabuoni family in Santa Maria Novella. So all these people are acting like princes. They are not so much businessmen and frugal merchants anymore. To the point that Lorenzo apparently at some point in time doesn't even have any money anymore, and he's forced to use the fund for paying dowries, il Fondo delle Doti, which is a kind of a public fund, in order to remedy some of the shortcomings in his personal cash flow. So Lorenzo's interests were in politics and arts, not in banking. Can we say that at that time, CSR, broadly defined, corporate social responsibility, had become a big distraction, not only for him, but also for the entire economic environment in Florence? Well, there are probably arguments to think that, especially when you look at the number of banks, which in about 50 years went down from 72 to 33. And in addition to that, especially for the Medici house, they had abandoned the holding structure with the death of another general manager, which was Benci. And I think another interesting portrait is the portrait of Ginevra de Benci, who you can find today in the National Gallery in Washington. I think done by Leonardo, if I remember correctly. With the death of Benci, the holding structure is kind of dismantled. What is the consequence of that? The consequence is that the director general, the last of them was Sassetti, was not so much interested in the whole group anymore. They were only interested in those companies, subsidiaries, where they had a personal investment. And in fact, Sassetti was a partner only in Avignon and Geneva, but not in other subsidiaries. So he became rich. He became rich because you have a Sassetti Palace in the center of Florence, in the Sassetti Street. You have the Sassetti Villa on the hills over Florence, which is today the seat of New York University. But he was not so much interested in an effective and efficient restructuring of a group. And so here we are to the end. The end, but there are also some previous events which are kind of preceding the end. I mean, you obviously remember the Pazzi conspiracy. But again, once again, it's interesting to see the family connections. Maria Baroncelli is the wife of Tommaso Portinari, manager in Bruges. Pier Antonio, her relative, was a director of a Pazzi bank in Bruges. Bernardo, the relative of Pier Antonio, is the one who is killing Giuliano together with Francesco Pazzi. And the Pazzi family is the one who took away the monopoly of alum, which was a very important product at the time, was a mordant used in the chemical industry. So extremely important, to the point that Florence declared war to Volterra in order to get access to the product and even destroy the city. So you can see the Pazzi are kind of competing in the they are definitely competing in the economic environment, to the point that they cannot stand any longer the preeminent political position of the Medici. So they come to the conclusion, the decision to try to get rid of them by killing them. But as you know, they only kill Giuliano and not Lorenzo. Lorenzo is surviving. Lorenzo, after the peace with the King of Naples, is becoming the Magnificent. So he doesn't need the bank anymore. He's going around with 12 bodyguards, and therefore he's now obviously playing prince, and he's not a banker any longer. So the family was saved. As you know, this family was saved by the two popes, which were part of the family. And it was saved in a successful way, to the point that, they become dukes and then grand dukes. And they even place a couple of their members as Queen of France, both Caterina and Maria, but the bank couldn't survive. The bank couldn't survive. It was liquidated in 1494. And there was a whole transformation of Florence society. And I think it's quite interesting to use a term which I found for the first time in a book written by Indro Montanelli, La mia Firenze, because he said that those days something was happening, because all the major merchants and business people became landlords, and they went to a process which he calls inspagnolimento. Inspagnolimento means that you become like a Spanish knight, not so more interested in banking and commerce, but rather in land possession and titles. and you are a rentier, so you don't engage into commercial activity anymore. You're just taking advantage of passive rents coming out from your real estate, from your land and other form of assets. But in reality, you're only interested in court life and you stop becoming a merchant. Interesting point which Montanelli makes is also that the spirit of capitalism which developed in Florence is moving north and is moving primarily to Geneva, where Calvin is making a number of changes which are conducive to economic activities. And then from Geneva, it expands into Northern Europe, primarily Amsterdam, London, and then subsequently to New York. And I think there is another sentence which I find very interesting because when in Mornings in Florence, which is a book on art written by an art historian now whose name doesn't come back, he's saying that the English girls are coming to Florence in the 19th century because they love to watch the paintings made at the time of the Renaissance, because in the eyes of the Florentine ladies, they can see the reflection of a golden florin as in their own eyes, they can see the reflection of a golden pound. I think I've finished. I hope it wasn't too long.
Bravo. Guys, do you have any questions? Yes.
I remember earlier in your presentation.
I don't hear you very well, so if you can speak loud, that will definitely help.
I remember earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that the Dutch East Indies Company was funded by stakeholders. Did that apply to every colony, or were just specific colonies funded by stakeholders?
Well, maybe I didn't explain myself well enough. I mean, they had, first of all, the Dutch East India Company was created at the request of the Dutch government. There were already several companies existing before. For each one of the major cities in Holland, they kind of induce them to get together and create a bigger organization. At the same time, the shareholders, let's be clear with the terminology, the shareholders were private individuals. So the owners of the shares of that company were private individuals, and there was a capitalist frenzy during the so-called Dutch Golden Century, because everybody was investing. I mean, the butcher and the widow, and you also have the so-called tulip speculation, which you probably heard of, where the price of tulips went through the roof, and it was probably the first and most notable example of financial collapse. But it's true that the shareholders remain primarily private persons under, if you want, the coordination and the sponsorship of a state. So the stakeholders are evidently those which do not own shares, those which are outside of a company's structures, but are still very much affected by the success or the non-success of a corporation. But the shareholders are already in a large number, And the number is so large that at some point in time, it is necessary to create a second board. So there is a board of directors, which is including 17 members. But then they create a second board, which is called supervisory board, which has the task of controlling what the directors are doing because they didn't trust them anymore. And this is quite peculiar because until that time, there was no such thing as a second board in any corporation whatsoever. But that tradition has remained and still exists today in Northern Europe. So, for instance, in Holland and in Germany today, you still have a supervisory board, which is a second board controlling the activities of the main board, which is the board of directors, and including within itself representations from society, so the so-called stakeholders. And in fact, in the supervisory board, if you take a company like Volkswagen, who is sitting in the supervisory board? You have representatives from trade unions, representative from banks, representative from the local community. So, by definition, all the stakeholders, all those people who do not own shares, so they're not owner of a share capital of a corporation, but they represent interests which are part of a broader social group and which are going to be affected by the way the company is managed in any case, because they have a vested interest. So it's important to have this to keep a clear distinction between shareholder and stakeholder. At the time the VOC was formed, the number of shareholders increased substantially because there was this capitalistic frenzy in those years, which convinced everybody to try to invest into it. But still, it was not the whole society, and therefore stakeholders were also very much present and had a role also in convincing management to create, for instance, this supervisory board I have been talking about. I don't know if that helped.
I have two questions, Stefano. The first one is, so you have talked about compagnia and commenda, no? Partnerships and limited partnerships. So
exactly,
it is that kind of distinction. And you were saying that in the 1300s, Florence, you had more or less compagnia, meaning partnerships. So, but we had the failure of two among the most important banks of Europe at that time, the Bardi and Peruzzi. Can we say that in the 1400s, and you were saying that in 1408, you have the creation of a well-established kind of a limited partnership, in other words. So we have the creation of the banking system that we more or less have nowadays. So you were making the example of the tree. So it means that you don't have only one body, but you have the main body and many bodies connected to it, no? The limited partnership. And this way you, in other words, avoid to have more failures than in the past. Can we say that this kind of banking system is the banking system we are more or less adopting today? First question. Second, you were saying that bank is magic activity turned into reality.
It was not me saying that. Huh?
I know. But can we say that, through the banking system, we develop our dreams? Question mark.
Our brains?
No, dreams. Dreams, like dreaming.
Dream. Well, in a way, and I can start from this one. Yes, in a way we do, because, with credit, obviously, as I said, you spend today wealth which doesn't exist yet. You know, you can build your house today, not because you have all the money you need to build your house, but because somebody else is making a bet on your ability to repay the debt. So he's giving you the money which you need today to build a house, but that money, it's not yours yet. You have to pay back. You will pay back by working for 20 years or even more, and creating wealth, which is going to allow you to repay the debt. So with credit already, we're clearly making dreams real, because otherwise it would not be possible.
What about the first question?
The first question is more tricky, because I guess the banking system today is certainly much more sophisticated than it used to be at the time. But it is true that the main concepts, one of the things I tell my students is the following: if a scientist from 6 centuries ago would come here today, probably they would not be able to talk to present day scientists, because there are so many different things which have happened in the meantime. But if a merchant would resuscitate and would talk to a business person today, I think we'll be able to understand practically everything. Because all the major institutions which we still use today in our economic activities, being them commercial companies, titre de crédit or a bill of exchange, promissory notes, everything which has to do with the creation and the transmission of debt. Insurance contracts, double entry bookkeeping systems, so accounting in general. Everything was invented between the 14th and the 16th century. And despite the fact that, there has been an evolution in terms of complexity and sophistication, but the basic principles are still pretty much the same. So I think it's fair to say that the current capitalist system, as we have it today, is largely based on those basic inventions, which evolved in a manner of becoming more sophisticated and more complex, but which at the root are still pretty much the same. That's why I think a merchant from the 14th century could talk with a today business person, because they will understand very well what they're doing.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other question, guys? Stefano, thank you very much for your contribution to this lecture. Very enlightening. And thank you again.